with part 3. We done upgraded our equipment a little bit, so hopefully the sound quality sounds a little bit better. The first 2 was live streams. This is gonna be on a pre-recorded video in case there's some things that we need to chomp in or edit out, get to the screenshots a little bit better. So on our last one, we talked about, in part 2, we talked about modernization. We talked about the Catholics versus the Protestant ideology. We talked about butternuts versus Yankees. We talked about Yankees versus Southerners. We talked about the Southern ideology as a whole, meaning slavery versus free labor. We talked about reform movements, temperance movement, meaning the banning of alcohol. We talked about the anti-slavery movement. We talked about the women's rights movements. And so in the previous 2 videos, I informed you a lot about the economic and social climate of the nation at the time, the Northeast, the Northern Midwest, the Southeast. But now we have to look to the West and to the Central Midwest to examine what was going on at that particular places. So like we talked about in the last one, slavery was dominating the political landscape from about 1844 on up to the Civil War. Other topics that were dominant in that political landscape was Texas, New Mexico, and the Compromise of 1850. Starting with Texas, Americans began migrating to Texas in the 1820s at the invitation of a Mexican government that had just won its independence from Spain. But by 1830, Mexico was alarmed at the influx of a population that was alien in language and culture. The Mexicans became suspicious of their political allegiance and their commitment to slavery in defiance of Mexico's recent abolition of the institution. The growing number of American settlers produced controversies over land claims and political rights. Events in Texas reached their breaking point in 1836. Texans proclaimed their independence from Mexico after suffering the massacre of the defenders of the Alamo, and then winning the decisive Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836. Texans captured Mexican leader Antonio Lopez, and they used him as a bargaining chip in the Texas negotiation. In 1844, John C. Calhoun finalizes the treaty that annexes Texas. Remember these names because, like I said, if we're going to go after some type of reparations, we need to know the names of the people who are responsible, the policies that they enacted, and all of this stuff is on record because Congress has always made records of speeches, who said what, who voted on what, so we can definitely find out who the perpetrators are. But John C. Calhoun, that's the name that you need to remember. So Calhoun, he finalizes the treaty that annexes Texas. He also publicly informed the British Prime Minister, or the British ministers, that the annexations were necessary to forestall the abolitionist plots against slavery. Calhoun and the rest of the Southern Democrats nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee. He was an ardent annexationist who wanted to expand American territory, and he was a large slaveholder. So at that time, Texas fever swept through the South. James K. Polk was elected president, and Texas became a state the following year. So James K. Polk is one of these culprits. John C. Calhoun is one of these culprits. But as president, James K. Polk employed a carrot and stick approach in 1845. He sent Louisianan John Slidell to Mexico City as a minister plenipotentiary, empowered to offer up to $30 million for California and New Mexico, as well as United States assumption of Mexican debts to American citizens in return for Mexican acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary. So simultaneously, while deploying John Slidell to Mexico City, James K. Polk ordered troops under General Zachary Taylor, remember that name, Zachary Taylor, into the disputed territory of the Nueces and dispatched a naval squadron to patrol the Mexican coast. He authorized the American Council in Monterey, California, to act as a secret agent to stir up pro-American sentiments among the local population. This included several hundred American settlers. The administration also sent contingency orders to the Pacific Fleet to seize California ports if war broke out between Mexico and the United States. The concept of manifest destiny had a significant impact on the Mexican War, but the main purpose of this presentation is to highlight the policies and the actions that actually took effect. One piece of legislation was the Wilmot Proviso, named after Pennsylvania Democratic Congressman David Wilmot, executed on August 8, 1846. David Wilmot authored an amendment to an appropriations bill that, as an express fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory. It was a source of sectional conflict for the next 15 years until the start of the Civil War. This clause was on behalf of Northern Democrats who had grievances concerning economic legislation presented by the Polk administration to withdraw federal funding for economic development. Southern Democrats were opposed to the federal government investing in development projects. Polk had specifically vetoed a rivers and harbors improvement bill. Since most of these harbors and canals were in the north, it caused grievances among Northern Democrats who already resented Southern domination of the Democratic Party. The Southern Democrats had sabotaged Martin Van Buren in 1844. They formulated the Walker Tariff, and they vetoed the Rivers and Harbors Bill. And also, a Southern president in Polk had conceded away half of the Oregon Territory to Britain, while insisting on all of Texas, and provoked Mexico into a war that Northerners regarded as a wicked aggression to expand slavery. And so political parties began to fracture along sectional lines. Prior to the Wilmot Proviso, slavery had been an institution beyond the power of Congress. States' rights versus federal rights, or states' rights versus the federal government, was the central conflict with the imminent acquisition of territory as a matter for congressional legislation. Thus, slavery exploded beyond party lines and became an arena for sectional conflict. The Proviso also affronted the South. To prevent slave owners from taking their property into territories was to stigmatize or to degrade them. So John C. Calhoun once again introduced a series of resolutions to the Senate on February 19, 1847 with regard to the territories. That the territories were the common property of the states, and as the joint agent of the states, Congress had no power to deny the citizens of any state the right to their property and to a territory. Therefore, slavery was legal in all of the territories. His argument was to maintain the 15-15 balance of slave to free states, thus making the issue between the North and the South sectional instead of partisan. And out of this rift, Calhoun hoped to create a Southern Rights Party. So out of all of this, John C. Calhoun was only out for political power. He wanted to create this Southern Rights Party. And so in the election of 1848, the Democratic National Convention could not prevent the slavery question from splitting the party. Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor, and he won the presidency because there was a division between the Democratic Party, so the Whigs won. Taylor was a war hero and a slave owner who had sugar and cotton plantations. With the Compromise of 1850, Taylor considered himself president of the whole country, and 40 years in the army and a lot of them as a general had given him a national perspective and a suspected distaste for pro-slavery extremists. So the pro-slavery Democrats thought they had a friend in Zachary Taylor, but his military experience and, like I said, him moving around the country and seeing and being introduced to different ideas gave him a totally different perspective. So he branded the pro-slavery extremists intolerant and revolutionary. The anti-slavery senator from New York, Senator William H. Seward, became one of his principal advisors. Remember that name as well, William H. Seward. The discovery of Sutter's Mill in 1848 brought an avalanche of settlers into California, making it necessary to provide political organization for the region. Already possessing twice the population of Delaware and Florida, California immediately petitioned for statehood. California would become the linchpin for Southern rights and power. Its admission as a free state would set a fatal precedent for whether or not slavery would flourish. This pumped new life into Calhoun's Southern rights movement. Southern radicals called fire eaters began to openly speak of secession. Secession rhetoric became commonplace. Violent rhetoric was followed by actual physical violence as several fistfights broke out in Congress. On April 17, 1850, Senator Henry S. Foote of Mississippi pulled a revolver on a colleague on the Senate floor. Senators Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun had all been born during the American Revolution and all died in 1850 to 1851. Four junior senators would rise to prominence during the 1850s decade: Stephen A. Douglas, William H. Seward, Jefferson Davis, and Salmon P. Chase. So the actual compromise of 1850, even though the original compromise was submitted by, who is it? John C. Calhoun, the compromise that actually got passed in 1850 was presented by Senator Henry Clay on January 29th, and it presented the resolutions to the Senate. Number one, that California would be admitted as a free state. The remainder of the Mexican cession would be organized as territories without the adoption of any restriction or condition on the subject of slavery. The Texas boundary dispute would be settled in favor of New Mexico, but Texas would be compensated by assumption of its public debt. Organization of New Mexico and Utah Territory. The slave trade in the District of Columbia would be abolished, but slavery itself would be guaranteed against federal interference. Another linchpin in the Compromise of 1850 was that Congress had no authority to interfere with the interstate slave trade. Number 6 was stronger federal laws to help slave owners recover fugitive slaves who had escaped to the north. The fugitive slave law had been the least debated part of the compromise, but it turned out to be its most explosive feature. There's a movie, 12 Years a Slave, that you can go see if you want to see how that fugitive slave law was working out. New Mexico was looking for statehood, but it had a boundary dispute with Texas that they were going to settle in favor of Texas and make New Mexico a state as well. Recently established Mormon settlement near the Great Salt Lake had adopted a constitution for a proposed new state named Deseret. Although slavery did not exist in Deseret, polygamy did, and that was equally unacceptable to many congressmen. So I think for part 3, we're going to put a pin in it right there. I'm going to come back. I'm going to layer this up by the time it hits YouTube to make sure that it has some visuals in there for you all. And then we're going to double right back up with part 4. So it may be 2 pieces coming out between this evening and tomorrow. Or I may just do them both over the weekend and release them on Sunday. But either way, you'll find out sooner than later. All right, peace.